The hospital never truly slept. Yewande had learned that in her first week at Severance, the way the corridors stayed half-lit through the night, the way the ventilation hummed at a different pitch after midnight, the way the cleaning staff moved through the halls like ghosts with mops, careful not to disturb the particular silence that belonged to the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. She had come to know this building the way she knew anatomy, every corridor, every stairwell, every exit. She knew which elevator was slowest. She knew which vending machine on the 4th floor still gave you a second can if you hit it on the left side. She knew the rooftop access code because she had charmed it out of a night security guard 3 months ago, telling him she needed air after a long shift. That had been the truth then. She wasn't sure what it was tonight. The night air hit her like a wall, cold, sharp, carrying the particular smell of Seoul in October, which was exhaust and river water and something faintly metallic that she had never been able to name. The city spread out below her in every direction, luminous and indifferent, towers of glass throwing light into a sky that never quite got dark enough to see stars. She had grown up under different stars. The kind you could actually see, thick and unhurried over Oyo State, her grandmother pointing out constellations with a crooked finger while the generator hummed somewhere in the compound below. She had not thought about her grandmother in months. She had not thought about much of anything in the 2 weeks since Amara died on her table. That was not her name. The little girl's name had been something she could not pronounce correctly no matter how many times the parents gently corrected her, a beautiful name, for syllables, that her tongue kept reshaping into something foreign. But in Yewande's head, in the space where she filed the one she could not save, the girl was Amara. 6 years old. Internal bleeding from a road accident. Golden hour, clear airway, every condition that should have meant she walked out. Yewande had spent 4 hours inside that chest cavity with the focused ferocity of someone who had never once believed the odds meant anything. And still, she was standing on the wrong side of the railing before she fully registered that she had climbed over it. It wasn't a decision, exactly. It didn't feel like one. It felt more like gravity, the slow, reasonable pull of something that had been building for weeks without her permission, a tiredness that went deeper than sleep could reach. The ledge was narrow under her sneakers. The wind at this height was different, it pushed rather than brushed. Below, Seoul continued its indifferent glow, 14 floors of it, and Yewande stood at the edge of the hospital rooftop and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, absolutely nothing. Which was, she supposed, the problem. She didn't hear the door. She heard the click of a lighter. Then the smell of cigarette smoke drifted to her on the wind, not cheap smoke, something darker and more expensive, and a voice said, in Korean, completely unhurried. The view is better from here. You're standing on the expensive side. She turned her head. A man was leaning against the railing 3 meters to her left, on the correct side of it, one forearm resting on the metal bar with the easy posture of someone who had chosen this spot deliberately. He was tall, dark-coated, the kind of still that didn't come from relaxation but from deep and practiced control. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the city, cigarette held loosely between 2 fingers, as though he had been standing there for some time and simply hadn't mentioned it. She stared at him. He took a slow drag, exhaled, watched the smoke pull sideways in the wind. You're trespassing, she said, in Korean. Her accent was good, years of study, 2 years of living here, but it still carried the rounded edges of somewhere else entirely. So are you, he said, without looking at her. She didn't have an answer for that. She turned back to the city. The wind pushed at her again, insistent, and somewhere 14 floors below a car horn sounded and then faded. She was aware of him the way you became aware of something that refused to be ignored, a persistent presence at the edge of her vision, unhurried, making no move toward her and no move away. Minutes passed. She didn't count them. It doesn't stop, she said eventually. She hadn't meant to speak. The words came out the way things came out at 2 a.m. when you were too tired for the machinery that usually kept them in. The feeling. I keep thinking it will stop and it doesn't. He said nothing immediately. He finished the cigarette, pressed it out against the railing with the deliberate care of someone who did not litter, and put the dead stub in his coat pocket. Then he said, still without looking at her. No. It doesn't stop. It changes. That is not the same thing. She looked at him again. His profile was sharp against the city light, strong jaw, dark hair pushed back from his forehead, a scar she couldn't fully see tracing something along his jaw. He looked like a man who had been told difficult things many times and had developed, over years, an interior architecture solid enough to absorb them. You don't know what I'm feeling, she said. No, he agreed. Then that was a useless thing to say. Probably. Another silence. The wind. The city. Somewhere below, a siren started and then stopped. Yewande became aware, slowly, that her legs were cold, her scrubs were thin, she'd come straight from the ward, she hadn't thought to bring a coat, and that the ledge under her feet was approximately 30 centimeters wide, and that at some point in the last several minutes the crisis in her chest had shifted slightly, replaced by something else she couldn't name yet. He still hadn't looked at her. He also hadn't moved. Hadn't reached for her. Hadn't raised his voice or used the careful, calibrated tone people used when they were frightened of saying the wrong thing. He was simply there, leaning against the railing in his expensive coat, as though he had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be, and Yewande found, to her own bewilderment, that this was the thing that undid her. Not urgency. Not alarm. Just someone deciding, without announcement, that they were going to stay. She climbed back over the railing. She didn't know why. She didn't examine it. She swung her leg over and dropped onto the right side and her sneakers hit the rooftop floor and she sat down immediately, back against the railing, knees drawn up, because her legs were shaking and she was not going to stand through that. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed, 1 breath, 2, 3, the way she made herself breathe in the scrub room before a difficult surgery. After a moment, she heard him lower himself to sit beside her. Not close. A respectful distance. But there. They sat like that for a long time, the city burning below them, the cold working through her scrubs, neither of them speaking, until her breathing evened out and the shaking in her legs stopped and the sky to the east had begun, barely, to consider lightning. What's your name? She asked at last. Jae-won. She nodded slowly. Yewande. A pause. Then, quietly, carefully, as though he were learning the shape of something he intended to keep, he said it back to her. Yewande. Not shortened. Not approximated. Every syllable given its full weight, unhurried, like a thing being chosen rather than simply repeated. She stared at the city and said nothing. But something in her chest, for the first time in 2 weeks, shifted. Not healed. Not fixed. Just, moved. And sometimes, she would think later, that is where everything begins. She didn't tell anyone about the rooftop. Not her colleague Dr. Park, who had taken to watching Yewande with the careful sideways attention of someone who suspected something was wrong but didn't know how to ask. Not the hospital's mandated wellness counselor, whose office she had visited exactly once and left after 11 minutes because the woman kept tilting her head at a sympathetic angle that made Yewande want to overturn the potted plant on her desk. Not her mother, who called every Sunday from Lagos and whose voice alone could pull the truth out of Yewande like a thread, which was precisely why she kept the calls to 20 minutes and steered them toward her mother's neighbor's drama and the rising cost of tomatoes in Bodija market. She told no one. She went back to work. That was what she knew how to do. She scrubbed in, she cut, she sutured, she saved the ones she could save and wrote careful, clinical notes about the ones she couldn't, and she kept her face arranged in the particular neutral expression she had spent years perfecting, the one that said I am completely fine in a way that discouraged follow-up questions. She did not think about the man on the rooftop. She thought about him constantly. It was Dr. Park who told her about the reassignment, 3 days after the rooftop, delivered in the apologetic tone he reserved for schedule changes and bad cafeteria days. Administration moved you to the private ward, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. Room 1108. Gunshot patient, post-operative recovery, admitted under. He glanced at his tablet and frowned slightly, a name I can't find a passport for. VIP handling. They want the best eyes on him daily. Yewande looked up from the chart she was reviewing. They pulled me off the trauma rotation for a recovery case. Apparently someone made a specific request. He said it carefully, in the voice of a man who had been told not to elaborate. She knew, then. Before she even walked down that corridor, before she pushed open the door to room 1108 and found the patient, a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s, healing cleanly, already sitting up and eating when he should have still been resting, she knew. Because there, in the chair beside the bed, suited in charcoal gray, reading something on his phone with the focused economy of a man who did not waste attention, was Jae-won. He looked up when she entered. Something in his expression adjusted, barely, just a fraction, and then settled back into stillness. Dr. Adeyemi, he said. As though he had known her name. As though he had known it for longer than 3 days. You had me reassigned, she said. She set down the patient's chart, crossed her arms, and looked at him directly in the way she had learned early in her career was necessary when dealing with men who expected to be deferred to. That wasn't a question. No, he agreed. It wasn't. Why? He set his phone down on his knee. You're the best trauma surgeon on staff. The records aren't difficult to find. My men took a bullet 2 centimeters from his spine. He deserves the best eyes on his recovery. A pause. You also needed somewhere to be. The last sentence landed quietly, without weight, as though it were simply another fact, and that was precisely what made it so disarming. She wanted to be angry. She was angry. But beneath the anger was the uncomfortable recognition that he was not entirely wrong, and she hated him a little for seeing it. You don't know what I need, she said. No, he said again, in that same agreeable tone that somehow managed to concede nothing at all. She came back every day. Professionally, there was nothing remarkable about the patient, a man named only as Mr. Shin on the official paperwork, who healed with impressive speed, did exactly what she told him, and asked no unnecessary questions. He would have been an unremarkable recovery case except for the men who sat beside him every single morning, suited and still, who asked sharp and surprisingly intelligent questions about wound care and infection risk and recovery timelines, and who watched Yewande work with a focused attention she felt on her skin like a change in temperature. She answered his questions. Professionally. Precisely. She did not look at him more than necessary. She looked at him constantly. On the 3rd visit she noticed the scar along his jaw more clearly, a clean, old line, long-healed, running from just below his left ear toward his chin. On the 4th visit she noticed his hands, large, careful, unhurried, the knuckles carrying the faint topography of old damage. On the 5th she noticed that he was always there before she arrived and always still there when she left, and that despite the expensive suit and the deliberate stillness there was something about the set of his shoulders in that hospital chair, something almost like vigil, that made her think, unexpectedly, of her father sitting beside her grandmother in her final weeks. She did not know what to do with that thought, so she filed it away and said nothing. The gifts started on the 6th day. She found the first one outside her office door, a container of jollof rice, still warm, from a restaurant she recognized. She had mentioned it exactly once, in passing, to a nurse in the corridor, complaining that she hadn't had proper jollof since she left Lagos. She stood in her office doorway holding the container for a long moment before going inside and eating all of it at her desk, telling herself it meant nothing. A week later, a copy of a surgical journal she had referenced during rounds, the specific issue she'd said she couldn't access through the hospital's subscription. 4 days after that, a pen. A good one, matte black, weighted exactly right, sitting on top of her locker. Her previous pen had run dry in front of Jae-won when she was updating Mr. Shin's chart. She remembered shaking it, frowning, borrowing Dr. Park's instead. She had forgotten about it within the hour. He had not. There were never notes. Never any indication of sender, as though the gift simply materialized from the particular quality of attention he paid to everything around him. She did not thank him directly. She told herself this was because acknowledging the gifts would give them significance she wasn't prepared to assign. The truth, which she admitted only at 2 a.m. when her defenses were lowest, was that she didn't trust what her voice might do if she tried. The night it broke open was a Thursday. She worked a double shift that bled from Thursday afternoon into Friday morning, 2 major traumas back-to-back, a teenager from a motorcycle accident and a middle-aged man whose heart had staged a quiet rebellion during what was supposed to be routine surgery. She saved them both. She always saved them, until the one she couldn't, and that was the particular cruelty of this job. The wins never accumulated the way the losses did. She made it as far as the break room on the 3rd floor before her legs made the executive decision to stop cooperating. She sat down on the narrow couch, intending to rest for 10 minutes before the drive home. She was asleep in under 2. She woke to a different quality of silence, deeper, later, and the immediate sensory awareness of something soft beneath her head. Not the vinyl armrest of the break room couch. Something folded. Something that smelled like expensive fabric and, beneath that, faintly, so faintly she might have constructed it entirely from exhaustion and wanting, like cigarette smoke and cedar. His jacket. Folded into a neat rectangle and placed under her head while she slept. She lay still for a long moment, staring at the break room ceiling, listening to the hospital breathe around her. The jacket was charcoal gray. Cashmere, she thought, running her thumb along the lapel. It was still slightly warm. He had been here recently enough that it was still warm. She sat up slowly, jacket in her lap, and sat with it in the empty break room for a full minute without moving. Then she stood up, draped it over her arm, collected her bag, and walked to her car. She drove home with the jacket on the passenger seat. She told herself, 3 times during the drive, that she would return it in the morning. In the morning she hung it on the back of her office door. She told herself that 2 meant nothing. She was becoming, she realized, a very unconvincing liar. Here's Chapter 3. Chapter 3, Dinner in a Restaurant He Owns. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday. Not a text, she didn't have his number, and the realization that he had never offered it and she had never asked sat in her mind with a significance she declined to examine. It arrived as a card, cream-colored, thick stock, slipped under her office door sometime between her morning rounds and her afternoon surgery. No envelope. Just the card, and on it, in handwriting that was precise and unhurried and somehow exactly what she would have expected from him. Dinner. Tonight. 8 p.m. The address is on the other side. She flipped it over. An address in Mapogu she didn't recognize. No question mark. No if you're free or I hope you can make it or any of the usual linguistic softening people deployed when they wanted something but were afraid to say so directly. Just the information, laid out with the calm certainty of a man who had spent so long operating in a world where his word was final that the architecture of asking had simply never developed. She should have been irritated by that. She was irritated by that. She went home after her shift, showered, changed into a burnt orange wrap dress she had bought in Lagos 3 years ago and worn exactly twice, and told herself firmly, in the mirror, that she was going solely to inform him in person that she would not be managed, arranged, gifted into softness, or summoned like a standing appointment. She was going to say that clearly, eat nothing, and leave. She was ready by 7:15. The address led her to a narrow street in Mapogu that she wouldn't have found without her phone's navigation, lined with the kind of low-lit establishments that didn't advertise themselves, restaurants and bars that existed for people who already knew they were there. The one she stopped in front of had no sign she could read, just a set of dark wooden doors and a single lamp above them throwing a small gold circle onto the pavement. A man in a dark suit opened the door before she could knock. Inside, the restaurant was empty. Not closed for the night, empty, set, lit, ready, every table dressed in white linen with candles burning low, the kitchen clearly operational because she could smell it immediately and had to stop walking for a moment because the smell hit her somewhere so fundamental she forgot, briefly, everything she had rehearsed in the mirror. Smoke. Palm oil. Crayfish. The deep, particular richness of a pepper soup built the right way, with goat meat and utazi leaves and the kind of time and attention that could not be faked or hurried. And beneath it, unmistakably, the scorched-bottom sweetness of party jollof, the kind made in a pot over fire, the kind her aunt made in the compound in Ibadan for every naming ceremony and Christmas and celebration that had punctuated her childhood like bright beads on a string. She stood in the entrance of this Seoul restaurant and smelled her mother's kitchen and felt something move through her chest that was entirely too large and too complicated to be appropriate for a Wednesday evening. You came. Jae-won was at the far end of the room, standing beside a table set for 2 near the window, still in his suit, different from this morning's, darker, no tie. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, steady, complete, like he was giving the act of seeing her his full and serious attention. I came to tell you to stop, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. Sit down first. I don't want to, she stopped. Because a man had emerged from the kitchen, older, apron-clad, Lagos written in every line of his face, who looked at her and broke into a wide, gap-toothed smile and said, in Yoruba, "I kabo, my sister. Jei-ki and muaunjwa. Welcome. Let me bring the food." She turned slowly back to Jae-won. He said nothing. He pulled out her chair. She sat down. He had flown the chef in from Abuja. She found this out gradually, across the meal, in the same way she found most things out about Jae-won, not because he offered information freely, but because she asked direct questions and he answered them with a directness that matched hers, stripped of decoration. The chef, whose name was Emmanuel, had been cooking Nigerian food professionally for 30 years and had a restaurant and was that Yewande had apparently mentioned to a nurse 3 weeks ago in a conversation she barely remembered. Jae-won had remembered it. Had found the chef. Had flown him to Seoul for 1 evening. That is an absurd amount of effort for a dinner, she said. You deserve the real thing, he said simply, and reached for his water glass, and that was apparently all he had to say about it. She wanted to argue with the logic and found she couldn't locate the thread of the argument. The food came in waves, pepper soup first, then jollof rice with the sacred charred bottom that Emmanuel had somehow achieved on a Korean stove, then fried plantain that was exactly the right ratio of soft to caramelized, then a fish stew that made Yewande close her eyes for 3 full seconds on the first taste, which she would deny if anyone asked. She ate without embarrassment, with the focused appreciation of someone who had been subsisting on hospital cafeteria food and convenience store kimbap for 2 years, and Jae-won watched her eat with an expression she was beginning to recognize, quiet, attentive, something in it that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "Eat," she told him. "Stop watching me eat." "I'm eating," he said, and took a forkful of rice without breaking eye contact, and she looked away first. They talked. That was the thing she hadn't prepared for, not the food, not the empty restaurant, not the jacket memory that surfaced every time she looked at him across the candlelight. She had prepared for the power dynamics, the careful management of distance, the professional frost she was good at deploying. She had not prepared for the conversation to be genuinely good. He asked about Oyo State, not politely, not as small talk, but with the focused curiosity of someone who wanted to actually know. She told him about the compound, her grandmother's garden, the specific quality of harmattan mornings when the dust turned everything sepia and her mother made akamu on the gas ring. He listened the way attentive people listened, not waiting for his turn to speak but actually processing, asking follow-up questions that proved he'd heard the details she'd mentioned 2 sentences ago. She asked about the scar on his jaw. He looked at her for a moment and then said, 15. Bad decision. Someone else's knife. He said it without drama, as a simple historical fact, and moved on. She asked about the scar on his collarbone, the one she'd seen shift into view when he leaned forward, his top button open tonight. He was quiet for a beat longer this time. 17, he said. My own decision. Someone else's target. Another fact. Filed and closed. She asked about his family. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, my mother died when I was 12. My father was not the kind of man who stayed. He picked up his glass. I had an older brother for a while. I don't anymore. She didn't push. She recognized the particular grammar of grief, the tense shift, the truncated sentence, the way the eyes moved slightly away and then came back harder. She knew it because she used it herself, when people asked about the one she lost on the table. I'm sorry, she said. It was a long time ago. But he said it in the way people said things they were still, quietly, carrying. The meal wound down slowly, the way good meals did, reluctant to end. Emmanuel brought out chin-chin for dessert, golden, perfectly fried, and Yewande ate half the bowl and felt more like herself than she had in months. The candle between them had burned low. Outside the window, Mapogu moved through its Wednesday night at its own pace, indifferent to the particular gravity building in the space between 2 people at a corner table. You said you came to tell me to stop, Jae-won said. I did. Are you going to? She looked at him across the dying candle. At the steadiness of him. The scars she now knew the ages of. The way he had said her full name on a rooftop at 2 a.m. like it was something worth getting right. The pen was too much, she said. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. The pen was practical. The journal was too much. You needed it. The food, she stopped. She pressed her lips together. The food was too much and also perfect, and I need you to understand that I find both of those things extremely inconvenient. This time the corner of his mouth became something she could actually call a smile, small, contained, but completely real, and it rearranged his face in a way that hit her with a force entirely disproportionate to its size. I understand, he said. In the car on the way home, his driver navigating the late-night Seoul traffic in smooth silence, she reached across the back seat for the chin-chin Emmanuel had wrapped for her to take home. Jae-won reached at the same moment. Their hands met, not dramatically, no electric shock or held breath, just the simple warm fact of his hand and hers occupying the same space, his fingers resting against hers in the dark of the back seat. Neither of them moved away. The city passed outside the windows. 20 minutes of it. His hand and her hand, barely touching, neither pulling back, neither pressing forward, just present, just there, just the quiet and enormous fact of contact chosen and held. He walked her to her door. She found her keys. Turned to say goodnight. Found him closer than expected, or perhaps she had stepped closer, she wasn't entirely sure, and in the amber light of the corridor his face was serious and near, and she felt the full weight of his attention like a hand placed flat against her sternum. He reached up, tucked one loose lock behind her ear with a care so deliberate it barely qualified as a touch. Then he stepped back, and said, in the low register he seemed to reserve exclusively for her. "Sleep well, Yewande." Full name. Every syllable. Unhurried. He left before she could answer. She stood at her door for a full minute after the sound of his footsteps had faded, one hand pressed to the side of her face where his fingers had been, the chin-chin container tucked under her other arm, the night quiet around her. She was, she decided, in a tremendous amount of trouble. She went inside and ate the rest of the chin-chin standing at her kitchen counter at midnight, and did not regret a single thing. She wasn't supposed to be in that part of the city. It was a Friday evening and she had finished her shift early for once, a small miracle she'd decided to honor by picking up groceries from the Korean African shop in Yongsan that stocked the particular brand of dried crayfish she couldn't cook without. She was in the back seat of a taxi, bag on her lap, mentally calculating whether she had enough palm oil left at home, when the car in front of them stopped abruptly and her driver swore under his breath and took a sharp left into a narrow side street to avoid the jam. That was how she ended up in the underground car park on Seoul at 7 p.m. on a Friday. The taxi had barely turned in when everything happened at once, two black cars blocking the exit ramp, men moving with the fast purposeful economy of people who had rehearsed this, shouting in Korean she caught only fragments of. Her driver threw the car into reverse, but there was already a vehicle behind them and they were boxed in completely, and Yewande pressed herself low in the back seat the way every instinct she had was screaming at her to do, her heart a fist against her ribs, the grocery bag sliding to the floor. It lasted less than 4 minutes. She knew because she was counting, the way she counted in surgery when she needed to anchor herself, one number after another, a rope thrown into chaos. In those 4 minutes she heard things she could not unhear and saw, through the gap between the front seats and the windshield, things that rearranged permanently something in her understanding of the world. And in the middle of it all she saw Jae-won, moving through the car park with a controlled, terrible precision, giving instructions in a low voice that cut through the noise, his face utterly calm, occupying the violence around him the way a surgeon occupied an open chest, completely, without flinching, as though this was simply the environment in which he functioned and always had. When it was over he found her taxi in under 30 seconds. He opened her door himself. His face when he saw her, still low, still counting, her knuckles white around the door handle, shifted in a way she had never seen it shift before. Something cracked open briefly behind his eyes and was immediately, professionally sealed. "You're not hurt," he said. Not a question. Assessing. "No," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of it and also aware it was a temporary condition. He got her out. His penthouse was 40 floors above the city and aggressively, minimally beautiful, all dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass and the particular quiet of spaces insulated from the world by money and altitude. She had never been here before. She stood in the center of the living room while the city burned silently below and tried to locate her anger, which she knew was present somewhere beneath the adrenaline and the shaking that had started in her hands on the drive over. "Sit," he said. "I'm fine." "You're shaking." "I'm a trauma surgeon. I shake after, not during. It's normal." She turned to face him. That was when she saw it, the dark spreading stain above his right ribs, visible only because his shirt had pulled loose in the car park. "You're bleeding." He looked down. "Graze. Take off your shirt." Something in the air shifted. He looked at her for a beat, then began unbuttoning his shirt with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, and she went to find his kitchen, located a first aid kit under the sink with the efficiency of someone who had been finding equipment in unfamiliar rooms for years, and came back to find him sitting on the low coffee table, shirt folded beside him. She worked quickly and without speaking. The wound was clean, a graze, as he'd said, 3 inches long above his lowest rib, shallow but needing closure. She cleaned it, sutured it with the travel kit supplies, covered it. Her hands did not shake. They never shook during. It was only when she had finished, when she snapped off the gloves and the work was done and there was nothing left to focus on except the reality of the evening, that everything she had been holding arrived at once. "I need you to understand something," she said. Her voice was quiet and exact. "I save lives. That is not a job description, it is the entire architecture of who I am. I have built everything around the premise that I am on the side of people walking out alive." She looked at him. Tonight I sat in a car and watched your world work, and I cannot. She stopped. Started again. I am not the woman who does this. I cannot be. He said nothing for a long moment. The city glowed behind him. He was bare from the waist up, her sutures neat above his ribs, and he looked at her with an expression that was more open than she had ever seen it, stripped of the careful management he usually maintained, something underneath it that looked almost painfully honest. You're right, he said. Everything you just said is right. She hadn't expected agreement. It disarmed her more than argument would have. I built this at 17 to survive, he continued, his voice low and even. It became something I couldn't simply put down. People depend on it now in ways that don't have clean exits. A pause. But I have spent the last several months, for the first time, imagining what a different life might feel like. He looked at her directly. I cannot ask you to stay in this. I also cannot pretend I don't want you to. The silence after that was the loudest thing she had ever heard in a room. She didn't plan what happened next. It arrived the way certain decisions arrived in surgery, not from thought but from a clarity that lived below thought, the kind her hands knew before her mind caught up. She kissed him. Hard. A little furious. Her hands still carrying the ghost shape of the surgical gloves. He went completely still for one suspended second, and then his hands came up to her face, both of them, with a gentleness so striking in a man built the way he was built that it undid her completely. He kissed her back slowly. Deliberately. With the patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this and had no intention of rushing it. They pulled apart breathless. His forehead dropped to hers. His hands stayed on her face. She could feel his pulse in his palms. I need you to be sure, he said quietly. She leaned back just enough to look at him. Picked up one glove from the table. Pulled it off one finger at a time, then the other, set them both down. Took his face in her bare hands the way he was holding hers. I'm a surgeon, she said. I don't make incisions I'm not prepared to follow through. He smiled. A real one, rare and slow and devastating, rearranging everything, and she felt it land somewhere deep and permanent. She was, she thought, in a tremendous amount of trouble. She stayed anyway. It was a Sunday that did it. Not a crisis. Not a car park or a rooftop or a charged moment with blood and adrenaline doing half the emotional work. Just a Sunday, gray-skied, rain-heavy, the kind of Seoul October day that made the whole city feel like it had drawn its curtains and decided to stay inside. Yewande had come over at noon, nominally to return a book he had lent her. She had stayed for lunch. Lunch had become the afternoon. The afternoon had become evening without either of them marking the transition, the way time moved differently in spaces where you were entirely comfortable, or entirely unwilling to leave. They had been dancing around this for weeks. Both of them knew it. Neither had said so directly, because they were, in their different ways, people who did not move toward things carelessly. Yewande had spent her adult life building herself into someone steady and precise, someone whose decisions held under pressure. Jae-won was a man who calculated everything, who understood, better than most, the cost of miscalculation. So they had circled this the way careful people circled things that mattered, closely, without rushing, making sure of the ground before adding weight to it. But there was a point, she was learning, past which carefulness became its own kind of dishonesty. They were on the couch, the city invisible behind rain-streaked glass, a film neither of them was watching playing at low volume on the screen across the room. She was reading, or holding a book open, which was not quite the same thing. He was beside her, one arm resting along the back of the couch, close enough that she was aware of him the way you were aware of a fire in a room, not burning, just present, just warm. She set the book down. He looked at her. There was a moment, brief, complete, the kind that asked a question without using any words, and she answered it by closing the distance herself, because she had decided some weeks ago that she was done pretending she didn't want to. What surprised her was his patience. She had expected, she didn't know what she had expected. Intensity, certainly. Control, yes. He was a man who controlled everything around him as naturally as breathing. But this was different. With her, his hands moved like he had all the time that had ever existed and intended to use every second of it. Like she was something he was learning, methodically, reverently, the way he had learned her name on the rooftop, not to approximate, but to actually know. He noticed everything. The exact place along her jaw that made her exhale. The way she gripped his shoulder when something undid her. The Yoruba that slipped out of her involuntarily when she was overwhelmed, low, half-formed, not quite sentences, and the way he would pause when it happened, patient and still, waiting for her to come back to him. He did not ask her to translate. He simply waited, and somehow that was more intimate than any word could have been. "You're staring," she said at one point, the city dark and rain loud behind the glass. "Yes," he said, unrepentant, and tucked a lock from her face with one finger. "It's unsettling." "You've been unsettling me for months," he said. Considerate returned. It was afterward, deep in the night, the rain still going, the room warm and quiet, that he let her see the things he didn't show the world. She was lying against his chest, her palm flat over his heart the way she'd found herself wanting to do since the night she'd stitched him, wanting to feel that he was real, that this was real, that underneath all the armor was simply a living person with a pulse like anyone else. His heartbeat was slow and steady under her hand. She felt it change slightly when she traced the long scar down his left side, the one she'd noticed weeks ago and never asked about. She asked now. Quietly, the way you asked things in the dark. He was silent for long enough that she thought he'd let it pass. "I was 19, he said finally. "Someone I trusted. Someone I'd brought into my organization because I believed in him." A breath. He decided my position was more valuable than my life. He was partially correct, the position survived. Another pause. He did not. She pressed her palm flat against the scar. Said nothing. "It taught me not to need people," he said. He said it without self-pity, as pure information. Needing someone gives them a surface to cut. She lifted her head to look at him. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, jaw set in the particular way it set when he was saying something that cost him. "That's a terrible way to live," she said softly. "It was a very effective one." A beat. "Until recently." She held his gaze. Then she lay her head back down and said, in Yoruba, quietly, without translation, "Mani-e. I have you." He didn't understand the words. But she felt his arm tighten around her, slowly, the way something tightened when it recognized safety even if the mind hadn't caught up yet, a body's honest response, bypassing everything he'd built to prevent exactly this. She felt, then, what it had cost him. All those years of it. The weight of a life built entirely without the relief of needing anyone, and how exhausting that must have been, and how much it meant that he was here, in this room, letting her feel his heartbeat slow beneath her hand. She didn't say any of that. Some things were too large for words and knew it. They stayed awake until nearly 4 a.m. Not urgently, just neither of them willing to close the night. They talked in the unhurried way of people who had stopped performing for each other, voices low, the rain a steady undertone. She taught him 3 words in Yoruba, Omi, water, Ife, love, Anu, mercy. He repeated each one carefully, getting the tones wrong the first time and adjusting when she corrected him without defensiveness, which she found she loved about him. He taught her, Gurium. The Korean word for the ache of missing someone who is still right there beside you. "That's very specific," she said. "Koreans are specific about grief," he said. She made him say it twice. Then she said, "Say my name." He turned his head to look at her in the dark. "Yewande," he said. Full and slow and unhurried, every syllable weighted, the way he had said it first on the rooftop, like a thing being chosen rather than simply spoken. She closed her eyes. There it was again, that feeling from the rooftop, that shift. Not healed. Not fixed. Just moved. Just the profound, simple, terrifying recognition of being known by someone who had decided, without fanfare, to actually learn you. "Again," she said quietly. He said it again. She fell asleep to the sound of her own name in his voice, the rain still falling over Seoul, his heartbeat steady under her palm. It was, she thought, before sleep took her entirely, the most held she had ever felt in her life. The boy's name was Kwame. She found that out later, after the surgery, after the paperwork, after she had stood in the scrub room alone for 4 minutes with her back against the wall doing the controlled breathing that stopped her hands from shaking. He was 20 years old, Ghanaian, studying engineering at Yonsei University on a scholarship his mother had apparently wept at the airport over when he left Accra. He had been in Seoul for 8 months. He had been in her operating room for 3 hours with 4 stab wounds, one of which had nicked his small intestine in a way that required the kind of focused, painstaking repair that left her shoulders aching for days after. He survived. He would carry the scars but he would finish his degree and go home to his mother. She told herself that was the only thing that mattered. She believed it for approximately 6 hours. It was Dr. Park who connected the dots, with the reluctant expression of a man who wished he hadn't. He found her in her office at the end of her shift, closed the door behind him, which he never did, and sat down across from her with a tablet. He turned to face her without speaking. A report. Internal, hospital security, flagged by administration. The patient in her operating room, Kwame, had been identified as affiliated with a network that operated in direct conflict with another organization in the city. The injuries were consistent with a targeted attack. And the organization responsible, according to the security flag, operated under a structure that her hospital had been quietly documenting for 18 months. A structure she recognized. She read the report twice. Then she set the tablet down and looked at the wall for a long time. "I thought you should know," Dr. Park said carefully. Given, he stopped. He was a kind man who had noticed things he had the decency not to name directly. "Given your situation." After he left, she sat in her office until the cleaning staff came through, and then she sat there after that too. She went to him that night. She had considered waiting, giving herself time to cool into precision, to arrange her words with the clinical exactness she used when delivering difficult news. But she understood, somewhere below the anger, that waiting was a way of losing her nerve, and she had not survived everything she had survived by losing her nerve. He opened the penthouse door himself. He read her face in under a second. She watched him do it, the rapid, practiced assessment, and stepped back to let her in without a word. She told him about Kwame. She did it the way she did everything difficult, directly, without softening, every word exact. She told him the boy's age and his scholarship and what his intestine had looked like on her table. She told him she had no proof of Jae-won's direct involvement and was not interested in debating degrees of culpability. She told him that she saved lives and could not organize herself around a person whose world methodically destroyed them. She told him all of it quietly, without raising her voice once, which was how he knew, she suspected, that she meant every word. He listened the way he always listened. Completely. Without interruption or defense. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "You're right," he said. It was the second time he had said that to her, and it landed the same way it had the first time, disarming, because she had prepared for argument and he kept refusing to give her one. "About all of it." "Then tell me something that changes it." He was quiet for a moment. He moved to the window, not away from her, just toward the city, his back half turned, the skyline throwing pale light across his profile. "I was 17 when I started this," he said. "Not ambition. Survival. There was nothing else available to me and I was very good at it, and then it became everything and everyone around me was inside it, and stepping out was no longer a clean option." He paused. "I have spent 15 years being exactly what this city needed me to be. I was good at that too." Another pause, longer. "4 months ago I started thinking about what I actually want. That has not happened before. Not once." She watched his profile. The set of his jaw. The old scar. "I cannot undo what the structure has done," he said. "I cannot hand you a clean version of this. I will not insult you by pretending I can." He turned to look at her then, fully. "But I need you to know that you are the reason I am, for the first time, thinking about what comes after." The silence stretched. She wanted to stay. That was the problem. The want was enormous and uncomplicated, and she hated it for how little it seemed to care about the rest of the evidence. She was a woman who dealt in facts, bodies on tables, wounds that either closed or didn't, conditions that either stabilized or deteriorated. Facts did not negotiate with want. "I can't do this right now," she said finally. He nodded once. He didn't ask her to stay. Didn't reach for her. She had learned enough about him by now to understand that this, the stillness, the not reaching, was not indifference. It was the deepest form of respect he knew how to offer. He would not hold on to something that needed to decide freely. She left. 3 days. She worked. She slept badly. She ate the last of the chin-chin Emmanuel had sent home with her weeks ago, standing at her kitchen counter at midnight, and felt its absence when it was gone as a small specific grief on top of the larger one. She did not contact him. He did not contact her. On the third morning she woke at 5 a.m. to the particular clarity that came after the mind had finally finished processing what the heart had known for days, and lay in the gray pre-dawn light of her apartment staring at the ceiling. She thought about Kwame and his scholarship. She thought about the boy's mother at the airport. She thought about all the ways the world was full of damage that predated her and would outlast her and that she could not surgeon her way through. She thought about a man sitting in a hospital chair every morning, noting the weight of her pen, flying a chef from Abuja, saying her full name on a rooftop like it was worth getting right. She thought about what he'd said. For the first time. At 7 a.m. her phone lit up. One message. No preamble. The jollof place in Itiwan is closed on Mondays. I know you try to go on Mondays. Wednesday is better. She stared at the screen for a long time. He had not said, come back. Had not said, I miss you, or please, or any of the words that would have made this easier to resist. He had simply, in the most Jae-won way possible, noticed her routine, filed it carefully, and offered it back to her as information. Practical. Precise. And underneath it, if you knew how to read him, everything. She pressed the phone against her chest and looked at her ceiling. She was not done. She had known it for 3 days. She had simply needed the time to decide whether not being done was something she could live with, and somewhere in the gray 5 a.m. clarity she had found her answer, which was, yes. Not easily. Not without cost. But yes. She typed back, Wednesday then. 3 minutes passed. His reply was a single word, good. She laughed, an unexpected, ungathered laugh that surprised her in the quiet of her apartment, and got up to make coffee. She booked the flight on a Thursday and told nobody she was coming. That was how she preferred to arrive in Lagos, without announcement, without the choreography of being collected from the airport and ferried through traffic with the pressure of someone's anticipation in the car beside her. She wanted to land, feel the heat close around her like a hand, and find her own way home through the organized chaos of the expressway at dusk, the bus conductors hanging from open doors, the hawkers moving between lanes with trays of plantain chips and phone chargers balanced on their heads, the whole loud beautiful machinery of the city she had grown up in and spent 2 years missing in ways she hadn't fully admitted to herself. Her mother's 60th birthday. The first she'd been home for in 2 years. She needed it, not just the celebration but the context. The reminder of who Yewande Adeyemi was before Seoul, before the hospital, before a man on a rooftop had quietly dismantled something in her that she was still in the process of rebuilding into a different shape. She told herself the trip was about her mother. It was also, if she was honest, about running towards something familiar because the unfamiliar had become very large very quickly and she needed to stand in her own compound and breathe her own air before she could trust any decision she made. Lagos received her the way it always did, without ceremony and without gentleness, which was its own kind of love. The compound in Ibadan was full by the second day, relatives arriving in waves, her mother presiding over it all from the kitchen with the absolute authority of a woman who had spent 60 years perfecting exactly this. The smell of the house, obe atta and floor polish and her mother's particular brand of powder, hit Yewande in the chest the moment she walked through the gate and stayed there, a warm anchor, the whole first evening. She helped cook. She argued with her cousin Tund about football. She sat in the compound on the second night with her younger brother Son, both of them on the old wooden bench their father had built, and talked until midnight about nothing consequential, his job, her apartment in Seoul, a film they'd both seen separately and had wildly different opinions about. It was the most relaxed she had felt in months. She did not think about Jae-won. She thought about him constantly. The call came on the 5th morning, while she was peeling ojid in the kitchen. I'm at the airport, he said, without preamble. Murtala Muhammad. I've never been to Lagos. I thought you could show me. She put down the plantain. You're at my airport, she said slowly. Yes. In Lagos. Yes. Jae-won. She pressed her free hand flat against the counter. You flew to Lagos. It's approximately an 11-hour flight, he said, with the calm of someone reporting a weather condition. I brought light clothing. I was told it would be warm. She stood in her mother's kitchen for a full 10 seconds saying nothing. The compound sounds came through the window, her aunt calling someone's name, a generator starting up 2 houses down, a rooster that had been causing controversy since yesterday morning. I'll send you an address, she said finally. She heard, very faintly, what might have been relief in the single syllable he used to answer. She chose not to examine how much that meant to her. He arrived in a taxi looking precisely like what he was, a man of considerable power who had been comprehensively defeated by Lagos traffic. His shirt, light gray linen, she noted, he had taken the warm weather advice seriously, was slightly damp at the collar. His hair was pushed back from his forehead. He was carrying nothing except his phone and a small bag, and he stood at the compound gate with the particular stillness of someone absorbing an environment that had immediately and completely overwhelmed every reference point he possessed. Lagos was doing what Lagos did to people encountering it for the first time. It was simply itself, without apology or reduction, loud and layered and alive at a frequency that had no equivalent in Seoul's organized intensity. "Well," he said, when she reached the gate. "Well," she agreed. He looked at her. Something in his face, the tight-held composure, the careful management, loosened almost imperceptibly, the way it only did when they were alone, and he said, "You look different here." "Different how?" "Like yourself," he said simply. "More completely." She looked at him for a moment, then turned and walked him in. Her mother found her in the kitchen within 4 minutes. She came in quietly, closed the door, looked at Yewande with the focused assessment of a woman who had been reading her daughter since birth, and said in Yoruba, "This man flew from Korea." "Yes, Mama." A silence during which her mother's eyes performed what Yewande could only describe as a full diagnostic scan. "He came alone?" "Yes." "For your visit?" "Yes." Her mother was quiet for another moment. Then she turned back to the stove and said, with the deliberate casualness of someone making a significant decision appear minor, "Feed him the real food. Not anything embarrassing. The real food." Yewande pressed her lips together to contain the smile. "Yes, Mama." He was, against all reasonable expectation, excellent. He ate everything placed in front of him, umla and yudu and bigairai, which was not a beginner's meal and which Yewande had half expected him to struggle through politely. He did not struggle. He ate with genuine focus and asked Emmanuel, her mother's cook, not the one he'd flown to Seoul, a coincidence she found quietly hilarious, the right questions about the preparation in a way that conveyed actual interest rather than performance. He helped carry chairs from the store when her uncle asked, without being asked twice and without making it a production. He shook hands correctly, learned names and used them, sat with the older men in the compound and navigated 2 hours of conversation through Yewande's intermittent translation with the patient, attentive intelligence she had come to expect from him. Her brother Son took 45 minutes. She watched it happen, Jae-won asking about the Champions League with the specificity of someone who actually followed it, Son's initial wariness dissolving into animated argument about a controversial call in a recent match, both of them eventually leaning over Son's phone rewatching a clip and talking over each other in the comfortable way of people who had found shared ground. She watched Jae-won in her world, stripped of his penthouse, his drivers, his organization, all the architecture of his power, and found him not diminished by the absence of it but clarified. This was who he was underneath. Attentive. Genuinely curious. Capable of sitting in an unfamiliar compound in a city that had already beaten him with traffic and heat, eating food he'd never tasted, among people assessing him with the frank thoroughness of a family who loved fiercely and trusted slowly, and simply being present. Simply trying. It broke something open in her chest that had been holding shut since she'd walked out of his penthouse 3 weeks ago. They sat on the rooftop of her childhood home that evening, the birthday celebrations winding down below them, Lagos spreading out in every direction, not Seoul's ordered luminosity but something wilder and warmer, a city lit by its own uncontainable energy. He was looking at it with the expression she recognized from his first views of anything that genuinely interested him, quiet, complete attention. "It's loud even from here," he said. "It's always loud," she said. "You stop hearing it after a while. Then when you leave you miss it without knowing what you're missing." He nodded slowly. Then, without looking away from the skyline, "I missed you. Without knowing, for a while, what I was missing." She was quiet. He turned then. Looked at her directly, the Lagos night warm around them, the city noise rising from below like something alive. "I came here because I cannot locate myself without you in my radius anymore," he said. "That has never been true for me before. With anything that could leave." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across and took his hand, not waiting, not being asked, just taking it, the way she'd decided weeks ago she was done not doing. He looked down at their hands. Then back at her. Something in his face settled, deeply, finally, like a thing that had been braced for impact and found instead solid ground. Below them, Lagos burned on, loud and luminous and entirely itself. Above it, 2 people held on. 3 months later, Seoul had moved into winter. The kind that arrived without negotiation, cold that had teeth, Mornings where the Han River sat under a thin skin of mist and the city moved through it bundled and purposeful, breath clouding at bus stops, the convenience stores doing fierce business in hot canned coffee that Yewande had developed an embarrassing dependency on. She had grown up in a city that didn't know what cold meant. 2 Korean winters in and she still wasn't entirely convinced it was a reasonable way for weather to behave. She had, however, stopped leaving her gloves at home. Small victories. Things between them had settled into something she didn't have a word for yet, not because it was undefined but because it was larger than the words she'd previously had available for this category of thing. He was in her life the way the hospital was in her life, completely, structurally, in a way she couldn't imagine the architecture of her days without anymore. She had a key to his penthouse. He knew her coffee order, her call schedule, the particular silence she needed after a bad surgery and the different silence she needed after a good one. She knew which of his moods meant he needed to be left alone and which meant he needed company he wasn't going to ask for. They had not talked about the future in explicit terms. They were both, she suspected, a little afraid of it. Of naming it too precisely and finding the name inadequate. Of reaching for something and discovering it moved when touched. But things were changing around them whether they named them or not. He told her on a Tuesday, over coffee, the way he told her important things, without preamble, without building to it, just laying it down like a document he had prepared and was now ready to present. "I've been restructuring," he said. "For the last 2 months. Legitimate acquisitions, logistics, private security consulting, 2 restaurants." A pause. "I've pulled back from 3 territories. The people running operations in those areas have been given alternatives or exits." He turned his cup in his hands. "It won't be complete for another year at minimum. Possibly 2. I won't pretend it's clean or simple." She looked at him across the table. "Why are you telling me the timeline?" "Because you deserve the honest version. Not the version that makes me easier to love." The word landed in the space between them. Neither of them had used it before, not directly, not plainly, not stripped of every soft casing. He had said it without flinching. She felt it move through her like something warm and irreversible. "Easier to love," she repeated quietly. "I know I'm not easy," he said. "Direct, as always. I know what it costs to be in my orbit. I am trying to change the terms of that. It is going to take time." He looked at her. "I wanted you to know I am actually doing it. Not for you, in the sense of a transaction. But because of you, in the sense that you made me want a life I could stand behind." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the cafe window, Seoul moved through its Tuesday in winter coats and purpose. "I got the fellowship offer," she said. He went still. "Lagos. The trauma program." She wrapped both hands around her cup. 5-year funded position. "I'd be building the unit from scratch, staffing, protocols, everything. It's the thing I've been wanting since I started medicine." She looked at him steadily. "I haven't accepted yet. I'm telling you before I do." He was quiet. She watched him process it, not with visible distress but with the focused inward attention of someone doing rapid and serious calculation. "How often can you leave?" he asked. "Every 8 weeks. 2 weeks at a time." He nodded slowly. "Then every 8 weeks I come to Lagos, or you come to Seoul. We build both. We figure out the rest as it becomes the rest." She blinked. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't simple," he said. "I'm saying I want to do the complicated version with you rather than the simple version without you." He paused. "That is a different statement." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had found her on a rooftop at her worst and sat down beside her on cold concrete without being asked, who had learned her name like it deserved to be learned, who had flown 11 hours to stand in her mother's compound and eat umla and argue football with her brother and look at the Lagos skyline like it was something worth seeing because she loved it. "Accept the fellowship," he said quietly. She nodded. Once. The decision had, she realized, already been made, she had simply needed to hear him say the other thing first. He put the ring on the table between dessert and the second round of coffee. No box. No bending. Just placed it on the white tablecloth between their cups, a simple band, dark metal, a single stone the deep amber color of harmattan light, and left it there the way he left everything important, without performance, without pressure, just present and available, waiting for her to decide what to do with it. "No ceremony," she said. "You would hate ceremony." I would hate ceremony, she confirmed. The question is on the table, he said. You don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer today. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about a rooftop at 2 a.m. and a man who had sat down beside her on cold concrete and refused to leave. A jacket folded under her head. Jollof rice in a closed restaurant. Gurium, the ache of missing someone still beside you. Her mother's kitchen. Her brother and Jae-won leaning over a phone rewatching a football clip. His heartbeat under her palm in the dark. Her name in his voice, full and unhurried, every syllable given its weight. All the small accumulated things that had built this, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but the way real things were built, slowly, repeatedly, with attention and intention, over ordinary Tuesdays and difficult Fridays and Sunday evenings when neither of them wanted to leave. She picked up the ring. She put it on. Not dramatically. Just, on. Then she picked up her coffee and took a sip and looked at him over the rim of the cup and said, I want to build something too. I just want us to agree on better working hours than either of us currently has. He laughed. The real one, the rare one, the one that started in his chest and arrived fully at his face, unhurried and genuine, the laugh she had catalogued carefully the first time she heard it because she had known immediately it was something she wanted repeated as often as possible for as long as possible. She felt it land and thought, there it is. That was the thing. Not the ring, not the words, not the grand resistant love story of it all, just this. A man laughing at her kitchen table in winter Seoul, real and rare and completely present, and her on the other side of it knowing she had earned the realness by being patient enough to wait for it. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything. That night the city held its winter breath outside his floor-to-ceiling windows and they did not rush. There was nothing left to rush toward, no uncertainty to outrun, no unsaid thing creating pressure between them. Just the ring warm on her finger and his hands that knew her now, fully and carefully, and the quiet understanding of two people who had chosen each other with their eyes open and intended to keep choosing, in the ordinary daily way that mattered more than any single moment. He said her name once, before she slept. Yewande. Full. Unhurried. The way he had always said it, like a thing worth getting right, like a word in a language he had decided to learn because she spoke it. She smiled into his chest. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside, Seoul burned cold and luminous through the winter dark, and inside, two people who had found each other at the worst possible moment held on with the quiet certainty of those who had decided, simply and completely, not to let go. Not at a perfect ending, but at a true one. At the beginning of the rest.